Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. A Ukraine deeply divided. Kiev's sovereign decision to walk away from an association agreement with Brussels has resulted in an explosion of street protests and violence. Some Western pundits have even called for the overthrow of Ukraine's current political order. It would seem those who ultimately lost the Orange Revolution are bent on giving it a second try. To CrossTalk the crisis in Ukraine, I'm joined by my guest, Alexander Mercouris in London. He is a writer on legal affairs and an analyst. In Brussels, we have Jan Techau. He is the director of the European Center of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And in Moscow, we cross to Mark Sleboda. He is a senior lecturer and researcher at Moscow State University. Our gentlemen, CrossTalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want. Jan, if I can go to you in Brussels, the Ukrainian government survived a vote of no confidence today. But at the same time, there are voices in the European Union and some prominent newspapers, as well as some prominent European Union officials, are saying that the government now in Ukraine is illegitimate, which is rather strange, isn't it? Because 2 weeks ago they were in negotiations with it. So are we experiencing a second Orange Revolution in Ukraine?
I'm not sure it's going to turn into a second Orange Revolution. And of course, it's slightly silly, as you say, to talk about a non-legitimate government. That's very clear. But it also has not been an entirely sovereign decision by the Ukrainian government, of course, to abandon and walk out from the association agreement, as you said earlier. You know, in the end, the decision of the Ukrainian government was one that was, of course, slightly forced from the outside, but was also based on very, very, you know, shrewd reasoning in terms of its own survival. The elites that are standing behind this government have come to the conclusion that they cannot make the leap of faith towards the West just now. Their business model would be in danger, so they try to continue this equidistance game that they've been trying to play between the West and Russia, and that's the decision that Mr. Yanukovych has been taken, and that's where we stand at the moment. And what the dynamic on the ground in Kiev is going to turn out like, whether it's going to be a mobilizing kind of effect again as 9 years ago, I really don't know. That's a very volatile situation. I wish that the Ukrainian government was playing it slightly smarter with the demonstrators, that's for sure.
Okay, Alexander, would you like to weigh in there? I mean, we heard outside influence. I suppose that means Russia. Anything that goes wrong in Ukraine is obviously Russia's fault. I mean, that's a default line for Ukrainian politics.
Well, it certainly is, and it's what the Europeans have been saying ever since this decision was made. Now, I've actually read the association agreement, and I have to say I'm not really convinced of that. My own view is that it is a far too ambitious document. It requires the Ukraine essentially to convert to all the rules of the European single market within 10 years. I don't honestly see how that is practically possible. And I think trying to do that would inflict an awful lot of damage on Ukrainian industry and on the Ukrainian economy. What I think probably happened, in fact, what I'm fairly sure happened, is that Mr. Azarov, who's the Prime Minister, had doubts about this for some time. He communicated his doubts to the various industrial groups in the Ukraine. They came back and told Mr. Yanukovych in a meeting about 4 weeks ago that this is simply not practical and it needs more time. Mr. Yanukovych and Mr. Azarov went to the Europeans and they said, we need a lot more money if this is going to work. The Europeans said that money isn't there. And so, at the very last moment, they pulled out. That's my own personal reading of this.
Okay, Mark, if I can go to you here in Moscow, I mean, you know, if you look at Western media and some Western politicians, this is a tussle between the European Union and Russia. But in fact, it's about Ukraine being divided and what kind of future it wants to have. And I would agree with Jan there. The Yanukovych has played this game, playing one off against another. And you know what? He hasn't gotten much to show for it.
Well, Peter, I have family in the Ukraine. My wife was originally from the Crimea, and so I have family both in Simferopol and in Kiev. And I can tell you that the way this is presented in the Western mainstream media as the Ukrainian people rebelling against their government is entirely facetious. This is a country that is extremely divided, almost along geographic and ethnic lines, where you have a Russian-speaking east and south of the country that does not want this association with the European Union, certainly not on terms that would mean stripping the relationship with Russia, which is what the European Union has demanded from the very beginning. They have, from the first point, denied that there can be any trilateral negotiations. And the Ukraine, both the government and a large amount of the people don't want to be forced to this bipolar Cold War choice. They would prefer to maintain good relations with both, which Moscow has also suggested depoliticizing the situation. But the European Union rather stubbornly refuses and say it's either our way or the highway.
Jan, would you like to react to that? Because it looks like it has been, the Ukrainians were given a zero-sum game here. And as Mark rightfully pointed out, if you go to eastern Ukraine, you'll feel like you're in Russia. You know why? Because they're ethnic Russians.
Yeah, no, I think there are two things that I would like to react to. The first one is that, of course, this is not a default Western kind of position that everything that goes wrong in Ukraine is Russia's fault. That's a very simplified way of putting this. Of course, most of what goes wrong and goes right in Ukraine
Western
has to do with
mainstream
Ukraine.
media on Russia is
so,
very simplistic.
You know, mainstream media
it's extremely
is
simplistic, okay? But I just want to point that out, okay? It's extremely
yeah,
black and white all the time.
It's about as simplistic.
Okay, go ahead, Jan. Continue.
Yeah, I mean, it's about as simplistic as the points. This is about as simplistic as the points that you've made. So in simplisticism, you know, I think we have a wonderful competition here. But let's look at the fact for a moment. It's very clear that this was a Ukrainian choice, but it's interesting that Ukraine was willing to initial the agreement and then not sign it. And what happened in between those two had nothing to do with them all of a sudden realizing that this was not a kind of favorable agreement for them. That, in that case, really had to do with the very, very strong Russian influence in this case, which is a perfectly legitimate thing for the Russians to do. But of course, in this case, one just must state the facts. The second thing that I would like to react to is this question of a zero-sum kind of approach. The association agreement for Ukraine would not have meant that the trade relations with Russia would have been, they would have been forced to abandon them, or that, you know, they would have lost all of their Russian kind of investments or these kinds of things. That's just a very simple myth. What is clear is that if you sign an association agreement, you can't be in another free trade agreement. That's a very technical and very, you know, basically accepted kind of truth. But we're not talking about a zero-sum position that the Europeans have given to the Ukrainians. Quite to the contrary. What they have said many times over is that this is not a zero-sum thing, but this is in the end beneficial for everybody involved. And that was made again and again and again.
Okay.
The one force in this game who said it had to be zero-sum was Russia in this case, because it basically told the Ukrainians that if they signed, they'd be punished for signing that. And that was exactly not the European position. The Europeans made an offer, and the offer was rejected.
Okay.
The Russians made an offer and said, if you don't accept it, we're going to punish you. And that's a very, very important difference here which has to be made.
Would you like to react to that?
Yes, a number of points. The first point to say is, if you look at the joint statement that Mr. Rompuy and Mr. Barroso issued some days ago, they make it absolutely clear that they blame Russia for the fact that this thing didn't happen. Now, as for whether the Ukrainians were fully aware of what it was that they were signing up to, sorry, well, let's dispute that, because I don't actually accept that. I don't actually think that the initiative did come from Russia, nor did I think that Russia, in fact, put the kind of pressure that our guest in Brussels is saying. Briefly, the point to understand is that Ukraine and Russia actually, at the moment, effectively are in a free trade zone. If the Ukraine adopts the entire system of trade regulation of the European Union, which is what the association agreement is all about and what it requires it to do, which means, incidentally, that it also has to follow, abide by future rules and regulations the European Union makes. in accordance with the interpretation of the European Court of Justice, then it is impossible to see how it can remain in a free trade zone at the same time with Russia. So what the Russians said, very simply,
well, that's incorrect. It is not impossible to foresee that at all. It's very possible, and the technical deal could be struck. We have 10 years for that. It's not impossible at all.
Let's let Alexander finish his point. Alexander, finish your point.
What the Russians said is, we are not in a free trade area with the European Union. Perhaps one day we would like to be, but we cannot have a situation where our market is flooded with European goods through the Ukraine, with which we have a free trade agreement. So what the Russians basically said was, if you go ahead with this association agreement, then your arrangements with us end. And that was something that I think the Ukrainians woke up to in the autumn, on top of the fact that the Ukrainian industrialists also woke up to the enormous costs this was going to impose on them if they proceeded. May I just make one very final point about this in response to the things that Jan has said? One has got to understand, in talking about the Ukraine, that Russia is there, just as Eastern Ukrainians are there. If you are going to make this work, if you're going to have some kind of an association with the Ukraine and the European Union, you have to involve Russia. You can't just wish Russia away. You can't just wish East Ukrainians away. You can't just wish the people who run the factories in the East Ukraine away. You have to deal with these facts. And that is precisely what the European Union isn't doing. And by refusing to do it, what it is actually doing, which is very dangerous, is that it is fanning sectional conflicts within the Ukraine itself.
All right, gentlemen, I have to jump in here. Gentlemen, we're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on Ukraine. Stay with RT. Welcome back to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing the crisis in Ukraine. Okay, Jan, I'd like to go back to you in Brussels. Would you like to rebut what Alexander had to say before we went to the break?
Just very briefly, I think there are 2 points. One is that supposedly there's an incompatibility. Yes, it's true that initially, of course, it looks like the two offerings, the Moscow offering of a free trade zone and the association agreement, are not compatible. But I mean, mind you, we have a 10-year period, for adjustment, and obviously it was very clear for everybody here in Brussels that this would include a deal with Moscow, and that was always very clear throughout the entire negotiations. And that leads me to the second point. It's not like it was said just earlier on the show that all of a sudden the Ukrainians woke up to the conditions that they could never meet. This has been a process over the last 4 years or so. The Ukrainians were fully aware of what was coming their way if they considered signing this. And just to make a U-turn on this in a very short period of a few days, really, where Mr. Yanukovych got the reading in Moscow, has nothing to do with all of a sudden, waking up to the negative consequences. I think it was outside players inserting new negative consequences. As I said earlier, that's power politics. That's the game that's being played. And I have respect for the shrewdness with which this is played. Nevertheless, I don't particularly like it. And I actually, in the end, don't think that it's good for Russia as well.
Okay, Mark, would you like to jump in there? Because I think really one of the issues here, but no matter what we look at timing-wise, if it was 4 years or last 10 days, I mean, it's still kind of an issue at the end of the day about Ukraine's sovereignty.
Okay, well, first I would like to say that John has said some quite factually incorrect things. The European Union has made it clear from day one that a free trade area with Russia, the existing Commonwealth of Independent States free trade area, is completely incompatible with any free trade area that the Ukraine might enter into with the European Union. So that would mean an immediate abrogation of that free trade area. And Russia is the Ukraine's largest trade partner. Last year, the total volume of Ukrainian-Russian trade was bigger than the volume of every country in the European Union's trade with the Ukraine. So that would be a tremendous blow to the Ukrainian economy. Second of all, this presentation that there's no question that Russia has deployed carrots and sticks, cheap gas prices, the automatic revocation of the free trade area that must happen in order to maintain this free trade area with the Ukraine, which they surely want. But the European Union has also deployed, well, I would say sticks and a lash, because there really is no carrot involved with this free trade agreement. They have threatened to withhold further IMF loans, not so suggested that it would not be possible to get further IMF loans unless this agreement is signed, which is essentially holding an entire international financial institution hostage to their geopolitical designs on the Ukraine. And secondly, they have made it quite clear that they will make things very uncomfortable for President Yanukovych in the Ukraine. And they have done that because we have seen European Union officials, politicians, including the sitting vice president of the European Parliament, in a flagrant violation of the Ukraine sovereignty, in the Maidan Square, cheering on protesters who are calling for revolution and regime change. And frankly, that is such an egregious violation of the UN Charter and international law. I think these officials should, at the very least, lose their job, and something should be taken to the International Court of Justice.
Okay, Jan, in all fairness, you want to react to that before I go to Alexander?
Yeah, I think Mark is getting worked up a little bit here on the international law issue and also on the sovereignty issue. Of course, in a free and open society, it's always possible for people to demonstrate on whichever side they would like to demonstrate. I think there's a profound misperception of what makes Mark's
These are officials from another country.
What marks an open society here. And yeah, I mean, that has happened in the past, and these are things that, you know, is something that is utterly acceptable in an open society. So I'm not quite sure that we're talking about the same notion of sovereignty here. The second issue that is very, very clear here to me is that I think Mark gets the facts wrong on the trade thing. He portrays it here as if all of Ukraine's business ties with Russia were at stake because of the signing of the association agreement. That was not the case. The Europeans said you can't be part of another free trade organization, but Ukraine hasn't signed a formal free trade organization. You know, that you say there's a de facto free trade organization with Ukraine is a bit of a wishy-washy kind of argument here, because the Europeans have made it clear from the very beginning that this was not supposed ever to threaten the business ties with Ukraine that Ukraine has with Russia. It's very clear that we are not playing this over here as a zero-sum game, as the many, many association agreements that the EU has signed with other countries have amply demonstrated. This is, for us, as a perspective kind of that we bring to this here as Westerners in large, and also as analysts, something that will create benefits for all sides involved. The ones that were threatened here and felt threatened were the Russians, because it's very clear that this undermines their geopolitical business plan in the region, and that is a very, very unfortunate kind of thing, because as I said earlier, we are very interested in having a strong and well-developing Russia, an offer that the West has made many, many times, and for some reason Russia seems to prefer to look at it as if they win, we must necessarily lose.
Okay, all right.
And that's a very, very kind of pre-modern way of looking at international politics.
I think it's a kind of pre-modern that the European Union knows what's best for Russia and Ukraine. Alexander, would you like to react to that?
Yeah.
No, that's not what I said. I didn't
Go ahead,
say
Alexander.
that's how you twisted it. I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Alexander.
Yeah, the first point to make is that, of course, the people who are protesting, on Sunday, were actually calling for revolution and for the overthrow of the government. So when people from outside come along and become involved in all of that, well, then one does start to become concerned. Now, coming back to the facts about the free trade agreement that the Ukraine, in effect, has with Russia, the fact is it does have a free trade relationship with Russia. to say that that's a wishy-washy thing simply doesn't look at the actual realities that business people in the Ukraine have to deal with. Now, as for the agreement itself, to say that the Ukrainians drifted into this is absolutely true. If you actually look at the agreement, it's incredible to me, frankly, that the Ukrainians could ever have agreed such an extraordinarily unbalanced document. But the fact is that they are extremely bad negotiators. They made a hash of their gas negotiations with the Russians when the negotiations were led by Tymoshenko, and they made a hash of the negotiations with the European Union about this. Now, the thing to do is to try to help them out of this situation. And the way to do that is to speak with the other country, the third party in this matter, and it is a third party, and it cannot be wished away, which is Russia. Saying that, it's very bad that the Russians do these things and they shouldn't behave in this way is all very well. It doesn't take you anywhere. The Russians have legitimate interests in the Ukraine, entirely legitimate connections with the Ukraine. They see their businesses threatened by this. They took action to defend it. If you're going to make this work, you have to talk to them. Not over 10 years, but now.
Okay, Jan, what do you think about that? I mean, after this fiasco here, and there is violence going on, and people are being hurt on all sides in Ukraine, maybe turn a fresh page and have a trilateral agreement, sit down all three parties. I know the European Union doesn't like to do it that way, but maybe the situation demands it.
The situation demands, of course, diplomacy at all levels. I think an association agreement between the EU and Ukraine is, as was said earlier, a sovereign decision of both sides and doesn't necessarily mean that a third party needs to be involved in a formal way. But what is very, very clear here is that Ukraine needs to sort out its business ties with Russia and that it understands and very, very clearly understands that the offer that the EU is making here is something that is not threatening their ties with anybody else in the world. As I said earlier, the EU has many, many association agreements, and these partners have never complained about the EU basically, cutting them off from the rest of the planet, as it is portrayed here. That is just a very simplistic way. And of course, and I must react to this, the EU does not know what's best for everybody in the world. There are some people in the European Parliament who like to proselytize, and there are some people here who are overplaying their cards, as in every political system. But by and large, the EU can only make an offer. It doesn't have any coercive powers, really. It is not going to threaten people, before going into such a treaty. And you could see that in the reaction when Yanukovych made his decision. All the EU did was to say the door is still open. There was no, ramifications. There were no threats or anything being issued, but a very, very clear offer that the door is still open. And I think that's the spirit in which this needs to continue. It's very clear that Russia is a partner in this. But it was said earlier, it's very nice, that we need to talk to Russia in order to have an association agreement with Ukraine. That's an interesting take on the sovereignty issue. Maybe then, according to that opinion, Ukraine is not so sovereign after all.
Mark, you want to reply to that?
Well, of course, because it's the Ukraine themselves who have asked for trilateral negotiations as well as Russia. So I think it's a matter of the European Union dictating the sovereignty of the Ukraine, saying that we simply will not accept a trilateral negotiations with Russia when both the Ukraine and Russia have requested it. So I don't quite understand that.
All right, we have 30 seconds left. Alexander will give you the last word on the program. Go ahead, Alexander in London.
Quickly, we're not talking about the association agreements that the European Union has with other countries. We're talking about this association agreement. If the EU wants an association agreement with the Ukraine, which will work, it has to be a workable agreement, and it has to involve Russia. Now, this is simply elementary. It's practical reality. One can get on one's high horse and argue otherwise, but all right, gentlemen, we've run out of time. Fascinating discussion. Many thanks to my guests today in London and Brussels and here in Moscow. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, CrossTalk rules.
I love you.